The photograph was old, edges curled in yellow, the kind of relic that survives in dusty attic boxes, forgotten until someone asks the right question. Benjamin Harper held it between weathered fingers, 72 years of living, etched into every line of his hands. Outside the window of his Minneapolis home, November snow fell soft and silent. The year was 1946. The war had ended. The world was rebuilding. And his grandson Johnny, 12 years old with curious eyes, had just asked about the strange cabin in the picture. "You see this building, son?" Benjamin's voice carried the weight of memory. Two walls, one inside the other, 18 inches of empty space running all the way around. Folks called it the 18-inch coffin. Said the woman who built it had lost her mind with grief. Johnny leaned closer. The cabin in the photograph looked wrong somehow. Too thick. Like someone had wrapped a normal house in another house and left a gap between them for no reason at all. "Who built it, Grandpa?" Benjamin smiled. Not the easy smile of a man remembering something pleasant. The complicated smile of someone who has lived long enough to see foolishness proven wise and wisdom proven foolish. "Your grandmother, Margaret Harper, my mother. And that cabin saved 17 lives the winter it was finished, including mine." He set the photograph on the table between them. "The coldest night in Minnesota history killed 3 people in our settlement. But in that cabin with its strange double walls and its 18 inches of nothing but air, we stayed warm. Warm enough to sleep without coats. Warm enough that my little brother Joshua, 4 years old then, played on the floor in his shirt sleeves while outside the temperature dropped to 38 below zero." Johnny's eyes went wide. "I'm going to tell you a story," Benjamin said, "about engineering and ignorance, about a widow who understood something the men around her couldn't see, and about a 9-year-old boy who learned that the strongest walls aren't always made of wood." He picked up the photograph again. "It starts in October of 1883. I was that 9-year-old boy, and I didn't understand what my mother was doing either." The memory rose up like morning fog over a lake. Sharp, clear, undeniable. October 12th, 1883, northern Minnesota Territory. The sky hung low and gray, pregnant with the promise of winter. Benjamin Harper, 9 years old and small for his age, stood beside a rope and pulley system his mother had built with her own hands. Above him, a 14-foot pine log rose slowly along the side of their cabin, creaking and groaning as the rope took the weight. "Hold it steady, Benjamin." His mother's voice. Margaret Harper, 43 years old, 5'4", widow of 6 months. She pulled the rope, hand over hand, muscles tight beneath her work dress, face calm with concentration. The log climbed higher, inch by inch, the sound of wood against wood, the smell of fresh pine sap mixing with the scent of coming snow. Benjamin gripped the guide rope, hands shaking, not from the weight, from fear. Fear of dropping it, fear of failing her, fear of what the men passing on the trail would say. And they did pass, 2 of them that morning, loggers heading toward the trading post. They slowed when they saw the strange construction rising around the Harper cabin, looked at each other, shook their heads. One of them laughed, not bothering to hide it. "Woman's building a barn around her house," the other spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Wasting timber, mad with grief, that one." They walked on. Their words hung in the air like smoke. Benjamin felt heat rise in his cheeks, wanted to shout after them, wanted to tell them his mother wasn't mad. But he was 9 years old and they were grown men. And in 1883 Minnesota, a child did not challenge his elders. So he held the rope and said nothing. Near the cabin door, his sister Sarah worked with careful hands, 7 years old, serious-faced. She sorted moss and clay into small buckets, mixing them in ratios their mother had taught her. The moss would fill the cracks between the logs. The clay would seal them against the wind. She worked with the focus of a child who understood that helping mother was the most important job in the world. And running through the narrow space between the old wall and the new wall being built, Joshua, 4 years old, wild-haired and laughing. He called the 18-inch corridor his secret road, ran back and forth through it again and again, delighted by the tunnel effect. Too young to understand why people whispered, too young to care. Benjamin watched his mother lift another log, watched her position it with precision, watched her check the alignment with a piece of charcoal and a length of string. Everything measured, Everything deliberate. Everything according to drawings his father had left behind. William Harper, dead 4 months. Pneumonia had taken him in June. 3 days of fever and rattling coughs, and then silence. He'd been a ship's carpenter in Norway before coming to America. A man who understood wood the way a doctor understands the human body. He spoke little, but when he talked about timber and heat and the movement of air, people listened. Benjamin remembered the last clear conversation with his father, remembered it with the painful clarity that comes from knowing something was the last time. William had called him to the bedside, handed him a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "This is for your mother. Give it to her after I'm gone. Tell her to build it exactly as I've drawn it. And Benjamin, help her. Watch everything she does. Learn it. You'll understand why someday." The bundle contained drawings, page after page of them, cabin plans, cross-sections, measurements in William's precise hand, and on the final page, written in letters that trembled from the effort of a dying man holding a pen, 3 sentences. "Build the second wall. The gap is the secret. Trust the still air." Benjamin had given his mother the drawings, watched her study them night after night under lamplight, watched her trace the lines with one finger, lips moving silently as she read William's notes. And one night when she thought he was asleep, he'd heard her whisper to the empty room, "William, I hope you were right about this." But there was another note in those drawings, a small one, easy to miss. In the corner of one page, almost hidden, William had written, "Don't make my Bergen mistake. The foundation must drain." Bergen. Benjamin had asked his mother what it meant. She'd hesitated, then told him a story. Before coming to America, William had tried to build a double-wall structure in Bergen, Norway, a storage building for a merchant. The theory was sound, 2 walls with an air gap between them to prevent heat transfer. But William hadn't accounted for water. Rain had seeped into the gap. In winter, it froze. Ice expanded, the walls cracked, the building failed. The merchant refused to pay. William's reputation suffered. He'd spent 5 years studying why it failed. 5 years understanding drainage and moisture and the movement of water through wood. 5 years preparing to try again. And then he died before he could build it right. Now Margaret Harper was building it for him. Building it with their 9-year-old son holding the guide rope and their 7-year-old daughter mixing moss, and their 4-year-old son running through the secret road that would either save their lives or become their coffin. The story Margaret told Benjamin one evening sitting by lamplight while the younger children slept began in Norway. A coastal village where winter wasn't just cold, it was brutal. A place where wind came off the sea with enough force to freeze a man's breath before it left his mouth. But the Norwegians had learned something over centuries of survival. Something the Americans building log cabins in Minnesota hadn't discovered yet. In every village stood small wooden buildings called stabber, storage houses. They had 2 walls, an outer wall and an inner wall, and between them 18 inches of empty air, nothing more. No insulation, no straw, no clay, just air, still air. Inside those buildings, meat didn't freeze solid in winter. Food didn't spoil in summer. The temperature stayed moderate year-round. And the secret William had explained to Margaret during their courtship wasn't the wood. It was the gap. The motionless air between the walls acted as a barrier. Heat couldn't cross it easily. Cold couldn't penetrate it fast. Margaret had grown up seeing those buildings every day. Never questioned them. Never wondered why they worked. They just did. That was enough. Then she met William Harper, a ship's carpenter with curious eyes and a mind that asked why about everything. He'd studied the stabber buildings, measured them, calculated heat loss, understood the principle of thermal conductivity even if he didn't know the scientific words for it. He'd courted Margaret with explanations of air and heat and the physics of warmth. Strange courtship topics. But Margaret had listened, had understood, had fallen in love with a man who saw the world as a series of problems waiting for elegant solutions. They married in 1868, sailed for America in 1879. And during that crossing in the middle of a North Atlantic storm, William taught Margaret the lesson that would one day save her life and the lives of her children. The storm had coated their ship in ice. Outside, the ocean was cold enough to kill a man in minutes. Margaret, pregnant with Benjamin, had been terrified. The creaking of the hull, the screaming of the wind, the bitter cold seeping through every crack. William had taken her hand, led her below deck into the cargo hold. And there, in that deep interior space, the temperature was cool but stable. Not freezing, not deadly, just cool. William had knocked on the wooden hull with his knuckles. "Feel this." Margaret placed her palm against the wood. It was cold, but not ice cold. "Two layers of planking," William said, "airspace between them. This is how ships survive winter crossings. The cold cannot cross the gap easily. The air between the layers slows the transfer of heat. Outside, the ocean will kill you in 4 minutes. In here, we're safe." He looked at her with eyes that held absolute certainty. "One day when we have land in America, I'll build you the warmest cabin in Minnesota, I promise." 2 months later, in a small boarding house in St. Paul, Margaret gave birth to Benjamin. William held his son and repeated the promise. The warmest cabin in Minnesota. But William Harper died in June of 1883. Pneumonia, yes, but caused by 3 winters of sleeping in a cabin that never got warmer than 45 degrees. 3 winters of breathing cold air. 3 winters of his lungs struggling against the frost. His body had been strong, but his lungs had been damaged in a childhood illness. The cold had finished what disease had started. 3 days before he died, he'd given Margaret the drawings, the perfected plans, everything he'd learned from the Bergen failure, all the corrections, all the improvements. "Build it," he'd whispered. "Build it right. Keep the children warm. Don't let the cold take them too." Now, in October of 1883, Margaret Harper was building her husband's final design, and the settlement thought she'd lost her mind. The first man to openly declare it a disaster was Robert Brennan. 49 years old, broad-shouldered, hands like oak from 3 decades of working timber. He'd built 17 cabins across the Minnesota Territory. Everyone still standing, everyone still occupied. In a frontier community where most structures fell within 5 years, that record carried enormous weight. Brennan stood outside the trading post on an October afternoon, watching Margaret raise another log onto the growing outer wall. He crossed his thick arms and shook his head slowly. "That woman is wasting good lumber," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Double walls, 18 inches of empty space all around. Might as well burn the wood now and save herself the trouble." Men around him nodded. They trusted Brennan. His cabins worked. His methods had survived 12 winters. If Brennan said something was foolish, it probably was. But Brennan's confidence hid something, a secret motivation. The trading post was expanding, new warehouses needed, and the Harper property sat in the perfect location. Close to the trail, level ground, good drainage. Brennan had investors ready. All he needed was for the widow to fail, for her to give up and sell. So when he watched Margaret building her strange double-walled cabin, he didn't just see poor engineering. He saw a business opportunity waiting to collapse. Benjamin didn't know any of this yet. He was 9 years old. He only knew that Mr. Brennan, who everyone respected, thought his mother was wrong. And that knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone. One afternoon, Brennan walked over to where Benjamin was helping prepare logs, looked down at the poor with something like pity. "Son," he said, "tell your mother to stop this before it's too late. Your father, God rest him, would be ashamed of what she's doing." The words hit Benjamin like a fist. His father, ashamed. He opened his mouth to respond, found no words, closed it again, felt tears burn behind his eyes and hated himself for it. Brennan walked away, and Benjamin stood there, holding a piece of sandpaper, shaking. That night he couldn't sleep, lay in his small bed and stared at the ceiling and wondered, what if everyone was right? What if his mother was wrong? What if his father's designs were mistaken? He wanted to ask her, wanted to say the doubt out loud, but he couldn't, because she'd lost her husband and was working herself to exhaustion, and Benjamin was the oldest child, and he had to be strong. So he said nothing, and the doubt grew. The work continued. Day after day, Margaret taught Benjamin how to select good timber, straight grain, few knots, the right thickness. She showed him how to use the Norwegian adze to shape the logs, how to cut the saddle notch so each piece would lock onto the one below it, how to mix moss and clay in precise ratios for the best seal. She didn't explain too much, just showed him, let him try, corrected his mistakes with patience, and slowly through repetition and observation, Benjamin began to learn what his father had known, That building wasn't just muscle and sweat, it was geometry and physics. It was understanding how wood moved as it dried, how joints tightened over time, how water flowed and where it pooled. He started to see his mother differently, not just as the woman who cooked his meals and mended his clothes, but as someone who understood things, complicated things, important things. But the settlement didn't see it. They saw a widow doing man's work, saw a strange structure rising, saw waste and foolishness. Eleanor Hastings came to visit on a cold afternoon in late October. She was near 50 years old, mother of 6 children, survivor of 15 Minnesota winters, a woman whose experience carried authority in the community. When Eleanor spoke about survival and child rearing, people listened. She watched Margaret measure a log with charcoal before speaking. "Margaret, dear," she said, "you are working far too hard for something that won't help you. That cabin already keeps the wind out. Another wall will only mean twice the repairs and twice the work. Winter is close. You should save your strength." Margaret paused, looked up, nodded politely. "Thank you for the advice, Mrs. Hastings." Then she returned to cutting the notch in the log. Eleanor sighed, looked at the strange double wall with something in her eyes Benjamin couldn't quite read. Not quite concern, not quite curiosity. Something else, something hidden. "Be careful," Eleanor said quietly, almost too quiet for Benjamin to hear. "I knew a woman in Wisconsin who tried something like this." She didn't finish the sentence, just walked back toward town, leaving the words hanging incomplete in the cold air. Benjamin wanted to ask what happened to the woman in Wisconsin, but his mother had already returned to work. And the moment passed. By early November, the outer wall surrounded the entire cabin. Margaret had built a second roof above it, creating a continuous air gap that ran around the structure like an invisible moat. The cabin now looked bizarre, alien, like something from another world. Thomas Reed, the settlement's chief gossip, described it at the trading post with obvious amusement. "You have to open one door," he said, demonstrating with hand gestures. "Step into this tiny space between the walls. Close that door. Then open another door just to get into your kitchen. It's like entering a bank vault just to reach your dinner table." Laughter filled the room. Men slapped their knees, shook their heads. The nickname spread like fire. The 18-inch coffin. Margaret heard it more than once. Never reacted. Just kept building. But Benjamin heard it too. And every repetition felt like a cut. Then came the summons. November 6th. The Settlement Council wanted to speak with Margaret Harper about her construction project. Immediately. Margaret received the notice at dusk, read it once, folded it carefully, looked at Benjamin. "Get your coat, son. You're coming with me." "Why, Ma?" "Because you're 9 years old enough to see how the world works." They walked through the November twilight to the settlement hall, a simple building, rough-hewn benches, a table at the front where 5 council members sat, Judge Morrison in the center, Robert Brennan standing to the side as advisor, 20 other men scattered on the benches as observers. Benjamin sat in the back, watched his mother walk to the front, straight-backed, calm-faced. But he saw her hands, saw them tremble slightly before she clasped them together. Judge Morrison spoke first. His voice carried the careful neutrality of a man trying to sound reasonable. "Mrs. Harper, thank you for coming. The council has received concerns about your construction project. We want to understand your intentions." Margaret nodded. "I'm building a second wall around my cabin, 18 inches from the original, with an air gap between them. For what purpose? To keep my children warm through winter. Still air acts as insulation. It slows the transfer of heat. My late husband designed it based on Norwegian building techniques that have worked for centuries." Silence in the room. Then Brennan spoke. "Your husband tried this in Bergen and Mrs. Harper. It failed. The structure collapsed." Margaret's jaw tightened, just slightly. "He failed because he didn't account for drainage. I've corrected that flaw. The foundation has proper channels. Water won't pool in the gap." Morrison leaned forward. "Mrs. Harper, dear, we're concerned for your children's safety. That structure is untested. If it fails during winter, if something goes wrong, those children could be in danger." "The structure is sound," Margaret said quietly. "You can't know that until winter truly hits." Morrison glanced at the other council members, then back at Margaret. The council is prepared to offer assistance. We can help you move into town for the winter. Find you appropriate housing. Ensure your children are safe and warm. Benjamin felt something cold settle in his chest. They wanted to take them away from the cabin, away from Ma's work, away from Pa's design. Margaret's voice stayed steady. My children are safe in the cabin I'm building. We'll stay there. Morrison exchanged looks with the other council members, then delivered the ultimatum. Very well, Mrs. Harper, but we require proof. Complete your cabin before first significant snowfall. Demonstrate that it keeps your family warm and healthy. We'll send weekly inspectors to verify conditions. If the cabin fails to provide adequate warmth, or if we judge it unsafe, the council will require you to sell the property and relocate to town for your children's welfare. The words landed like stones. Complete it before snow. Prove it works, or lose everything. Benjamin saw his mother's hands shake harder, saw her press them flat against her sides to still them. But her voice stayed level. I'll prove it. By December, you'll see the cabin works. You have my word. She turned and walked out. Benjamin followed. They walked home through darkness, neither speaking. But when they reached the cabin, Margaret stopped, put a hand on Benjamin's shoulder. They're afraid, she said. People fear what they don't understand. Your father knew that. That's why he said, build first, explain later. We'll finish this, Benjamin, and we'll prove them all wrong. Benjamin wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that Pa's design would work. But doubt still lived in his chest. A 9-year-old boy's doubt. Powerful, persistent. That night he lay awake for hours, finally got up, found paper and a stub of pencil. Drew a copy of his father's design from memory, the 2 walls, the gap, the drainage channels at the foundation. In the morning he showed it to his mother. I want to understand, he said. Teach me why it works. Margaret looked at the drawing, then at her son, and something changed in her eyes. Pride mixed with determination. All right, she said, I'll teach you everything. The work intensified. November 6th to November 20th, 14 days of dawn to dusk labor. Margaret and Benjamin working side by side. Sarah helping with sealing. Joshua staying with Eleanor Hastings during the long work days. Benjamin's hands blistered. His back ached. His arms trembled with fatigue by each evening. But he didn't complain. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. Something important. His mother taught him about heat and air, about conduction versus convection. Explained it in simple terms that a 9-year-old could grasp. Moving air carries heat away, she said, like wind on your skin. But if the air can't move, if it's trapped and still, it holds heat. Doesn't let it escape. That gap between our walls traps the air, makes it still. And still air is one of nature's best insulators. Benjamin started to understand, not perfectly, but enough. November 10th, the outer wall reached 8 feet. November 15th, the outer wall complete. November 18th, the double door system installed, windows recessed into deep tunnels through both walls. November 16th brought rain. Cold rain that turned the ground to mud and made everything harder. But it also brought a discovery. Benjamin was checking the foundation in the gap, making sure no debris had fallen between the walls. He noticed something, a small pool of water in the northeast corner, just sitting there, not draining. He remembered his father's note. The foundation must drain. Ma, Margaret came immediately, saw the water. Her face went pale. If that freezes, Benjamin said, it'll expand, break the walls. Margaret nodded. We have to fix the drainage, now. 2 days of extra work, digging new channels around the foundation, creating slopes for water flow, making sure every corner drained properly. The work they thought was finished had to be redone. But while digging, Benjamin found something. A small Norwegian coin. Old. Worn smooth. It must have fallen from his father's pocket years ago when William was building the original cabin. Margaret picked it up, held it in her palm. For a long moment she just stared at it. Then Benjamin saw tears on her cheeks, silent tears that fell and dried in the cold wind. He's still guiding us, she whispered. By November 25th, the cabin was complete. 2 walls, 2 roofs, double doors, recessed windows, an 18-inch gap running continuously around the entire structure. Drainage channels properly installed, moss and clay sealing every crack. It looked strange, looked wrong, looked like nothing anyone in the settlement had ever seen. Thomas Reed stood outside the trading post and described it to a group of men. "The 18-inch coffin is finished," he announced. "Now we wait for winter to bury that poor widow's foolishness under snow and ice." Men laughed, shook their heads, placed bets on how long it would take for Margaret to give up and move to town. But that evening, standing beside her completed cabin, Margaret Harper felt something different. Not certainty, not confidence, just a quiet belief that her husband had been right, that the gap would work, that the still air would hold the heat. Benjamin stood beside her, looked at the strange structure, and for the first time since his father died, he felt something like hope. The sky smelled like iron. The temperature was dropping. Winter was coming, and the test was about to begin. Johnny leaned forward in his chair, elbows on knees, eyes fixed on his grandfather's face. Outside, the November snow of 1946 continued its gentle fall, but inside that Minneapolis living room, the boy was somewhere else. Minnesota territory, 1883, living through his grandfather's memory. "Grandpa," Johnny said, "but grandmother was right, wasn't she?" "The cabin worked." Benjamin Harper smiled, the kind of smile that comes from having lived 72 years and learned that the path from doubt to certainty is never straight. "Be patient, son. Before I tell you about the proof, I have to tell you about the waiting." That was the hardest part. Not the building, not the work. The waiting to see if all that effort meant anything at all. He shifted in his chair, remembering. The cabin was finished November 25th, and then nothing happened. No snow. The temperature stayed mild, unseasonably warm for late November in Minnesota. Every morning I'd wake up and look outside expecting winter. Every morning just gray ski and cold ground. No snow. The memory pulled him back. Late November 1883. The settlement held its breath. Margaret Harper's strange cabin stood complete, looking like something that had wandered in from a fever dream. 2 walls, 2 roofs, a perpetual 18-inch gap running around it like a secret kept in wood and air. The council had extended their deadline. First significant snowfall, they'd said. Until then, Margaret had time. But that time felt like a wait, a suspended sentence waiting to fall. Benjamin watched his mother begin something new, something he'd never seen before. She took one of his father's old ship logs, a leather-bound book with blank pages William had never used, and she started recording temperatures. Every 6 hours, 4 times a day. She'd step outside with the thermometer, wait for it to stabilize, write down the number. Then she'd check the interior temperature, mark that down too. And beside each entry, she'd note how much wood they'd burned. "Why are you writing all this down, Ma?" Benjamin asked. Margaret looked at him with serious eyes. "Because feeling warm isn't proof, Benjamin. Numbers are proof. When they come to inspect, I won't just tell them the cabin works. I'll show them the data." Benjamin didn't fully understand the word data, but he understood the idea. His mother was building a case the way a lawyer builds an argument, with evidence, with facts that couldn't be dismissed as a woman's imagination or a widow's desperation. She taught him how to read the thermometer, how to wait for the mercury to stop moving, how to record the numbers in neat columns. And slowly he began to see what his father must have seen, that the world wasn't just things you could touch. It was also numbers and patterns and relationships between invisible forces like heat and cold. The settlement watched, waited, some with curiosity, most with the patient certainty of people who know they're about to be proven right. Robert Brennan watched Margaret's woodpile, noticed it wasn't growing the way his was, assumed she was hiding wood somewhere, or burning furniture, or lying. He mentioned it at the trading post more than once. "The widow's not stocking enough fuel," he'd say, shaking his head. "When real winter hits, she'll freeze those children or burn through her supplies in a week." Men nodded agreement. Brennan knew winter preparation. If he said Margaret's supplies were insufficient, they probably were. But what Brennan didn't know, what none of them knew except Anders Johansson, was that Margaret had calculated her needs precisely, had measured the cabin's volume, estimated heat loss through the still air gap, and determined exactly how much wood she'd require. Her pile looked small because it was small, because she wouldn't need more. December 1st arrived with snow. Finally, light snow that dusted the ground and trees and made the world look clean. The temperature dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Benjamin woke before dawn. His mother was already up, standing outside with a thermometer. "Time to start recording," she said. "This is what matters now." They took the first measurements together. Exterior temperature 18 degrees, interior temperature 62 degrees. Wood burned in the past 24 hours, 1/8 of a cord. Margaret wrote the numbers in her careful hand. Then she did something Benjamin never forgot. She smiled. A real smile. The first one he'd seen since his father died. "It's working," she said quietly. "Benjamin, it's actually working." And it was. Over the next 5 days, the pattern held. Exterior temperatures ranged from 15 to 20 degrees. Interior stayed between 62 and 64. Wood consumption remained minimal. A quarter cord every 2 days, sometimes less. Benjamin walked past neighbors' cabins and saw smoke pouring from their chimneys. Constant, heavy, the smell of burning wood everywhere. At the Brennan place, the woodpile shrank visibly day by day. At the Sullivan cabin, smoke rose thick and dark from morning to night. But at the Harper cabin, the stove burned quietly. Steadily. No roaring fire needed, just consistent, moderate heat. Inside, the difference was even more striking. Sarah and Joshua played on the floor in regular clothes. No coats, no blankets wrapped around them. When they went to bed, one quilt was enough. The interior walls felt warm to the touch. The air itself felt different, gentle, comfortable. Benjamin started to believe. Not because his mother told him to, because the evidence was undeniable. But believing and being accepted are different things. School was getting worse. The small settlement school met 3 days a week in a room behind the trading post. Mrs. Patterson taught reading and arithmetic to 20 children ranging from 6 to 14 years old. Benjamin had always liked school, had been good at numbers, had friends, not anymore. Tommy Brennan Roberts' oldest son led the harassment. 12 years old and built like his father. Strong, confident, mean when he wanted to be. "Harper's ma built a coffin," Tommy would say during recess. "Going to bury the whole family when winter really hits." The other boys laughed, repeated it, made it worse. "Which cabin?" one said. "That's what my pa calls it." "My ma says Mrs. Harper's gone simple in the head," another added. "Says grief does that to women." Benjamin tried to ignore it, tried to be like his mother, calm and focused and above the mockery. But he was 9 years old and the words hurt, each one a small cut, and cuts, even small ones, add up. One afternoon, Tommy pushed it too far. Cornered Benjamin after school, 3 other boys backing him up. "Your ma's crazy, Harper, and your dead pa would be ashamed of what she's doing." Something broke inside Benjamin. The mention of his father, the word ashamed, the same word Brennan Sr. had used. He swung, caught Tommy in the mouth, drew blood. Tommy, bigger and stronger, hit back. Hard. Benjamin went down, got kicked twice before Mrs. Patterson pulled them apart. She suspended both boys. 3 days, sent notes home with them explaining the fight. Benjamin walked home with a split lip and a black eye, forming, terrified of what his mother would say. He'd fought. He'd been suspended. He'd failed to control himself. Margaret looked at his face when he came in. Didn't ask what happened. Just got a wet cloth and cleaned the blood. Then she read the note from Mrs. Patterson. "You hit Tommy Brennan," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" Benjamin's voice cracked. "He said Pa would be ashamed of you, of the cabin. I couldn't let him say that." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she put the cloth down and looked at her son. "Sometimes you have to stand up, Benjamin. Sometimes silence is worse than fighting, but choose your battles wisely. Don't let other people's fear make you angry. That gives them power over you." She didn't punish him, didn't lecture, just pulled him close for a moment, let him feel that he wasn't alone in this. But that night, lying in bed, Benjamin felt something he hadn't felt before. A deep, exhausting doubt, not about the cabin, about whether it was worth it, worth the isolation, worth the mockery, worth being different. The thought came unbidden, terrible, shameful. What if we just tore down the outer wall? What if we were normal again? He didn't say it out loud, but the thought was there, and it grew. December 11th brought a visitor, John Sullivan, council member, and settlement's most reliable builder after Brennan. He arrived at dawn unannounced as the council had authorized. "Weekly inspection, Mrs. Harper," he said. "Council's orders?" Margaret nodded. "Come in." Sullivan entered through the double-door system, first the outer door, step into the airlock space, close the outer door, then the inner door, and as he stepped into that 18-inch gap between the two doors, something happened to his face. Surprise? Confusion. He touched the inner wall with one hand, then reached back and touched the outer door. Stood there for a moment processing. Then Margaret opened the inner door and warmth rolled out, real warmth, 63 degrees. Sullivan stepped inside and stopped. Just stood there in the doorway looking around. Children playing on the floor, Benjamin reading at the table, Sarah drawing pictures, Joshua building something with wooden blocks. No one wearing coats, no one huddled near the stove. The fire burning quietly, not roaring. Sullivan walked to the stove, held his hand near it, not blazing hot, just steady heat. He walked to the wall, pressed his palm against it. Warm wood. Margaret showed him the inspection point she'd left in the wall, a small gap where you could reach through and touch the outer wall surface. Sullivan put his hand through, felt the outer wall. It was cold, nearly frozen. Two surfaces, 18 inches apart. One warm, one cold. Between them, nothing but still air. Sullivan looked at Margaret with something like awe. "It works," he said. "Mrs. Harper, it actually works." "Yes, sir, it does." "How warm is it in here?" Margaret showed him the temperature log. 3 weeks of data, interior temperatures averaging 63 degrees, wood consumption a fraction of what neighbors were using. Sullivan studied the numbers, looked around the cabin again, touched the walls again, trying to understand something that defied his experience. "I need to report this to the council," he said. "I know." He left. And that evening, the settlement learned something that should have changed everything. John Sullivan, respected builder and honest man, had verified that the widow's cabin worked, that the double wall design with its 18-inch gap actually kept a family warm with minimal fuel. But Robert Brennan refused to believe it. "The thermometer must be faulty," he told the council that night. Or Sullivan was confused by the warmth of bodies in a small space. "It can't work. The principle is unsound." He said it with such conviction that half the council believed him, and the settlement remained divided. Some curious, some convinced Margaret had found something real, but most still skeptical, still waiting for the design to fail. Benjamin heard about it from Tommy Brennan at school. Tommy, lips still swollen from their fight, delivered the message with cruel satisfaction. "My pa says your cabin's a trick. Says it'll fail when real winter comes. Says you're all gonna freeze, and then the council will take you away." Benjamin said nothing, walked away, but the words followed him. That night, December 16th, after another day of isolation and mockery and doubt, Benjamin broke. He found his mother checking the evening temperature, stood beside her, and said the thing he'd been thinking for days. "Ma, can we just tear down the outer wall? Can we be normal again?" Margaret's hand froze on the thermometer. She turned to look at him. "What did you say?" The words came out in a rush, all the pain and fear and exhaustion. "I don't have any friends anymore. Everyone thinks we're crazy. Tommy says we're going to freeze, and the council's going to take us away. I just want to be normal. I want people to stop laughing at us." Margaret set down the thermometer, looked at her 9-year-old son, and Benjamin saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, something deeper. Sadness mixed with understanding, mixed with absolute resolve. "Come with me," she said. She led him to the trunk where she kept William's belongings, pulled out the bundle of drawings, laid them on the table. "Your father died because normal cabins weren't warm enough, Benjamin. 3 winters of sleeping in 40-degree cold. 3 winters of breathing frozen air. His lungs couldn't take it. The pneumonia that killed him came from the cold, from living in a cabin that barely kept him alive." She pointed to the drawings. "This wall isn't about being different. It's about staying alive. It's about making sure you and Sarah and Joshua don't suffer what your father suffered. Don't die the way he died." Benjamin felt tears coming. Tried to stop them. Couldn't. "But I don't have any friends." Margaret pulled him close, let him cry against her shoulder. You'll have friends who matter, son. The ones who see the truth, the ones who aren't afraid of something new. But right now you have something more important than friends. You have family, and you have the knowledge that we're doing something right even when everyone says it's wrong. Sarah, 7 years old, had been listening from the doorway. She came over and hugged Benjamin too. I like our warm house, Benji, she said softly. I don't want to be cold like the other kids. And Joshua, 4 years old and barely understanding, added his small voice. Don't be sad. We have the secret road. Benjamin wiped his eyes, felt ashamed of his tears, but also somehow lighter. His mother was right. His father had died from the cold. This cabin was meant to prevent that, to keep them alive. He nodded. I'm sorry, Ma. Don't be sorry for feeling what you feel. Be strong enough to keep going anyway. Later that night, there was a knock at the door. Benjamin opened it. Eleanor Hastings stood outside alone, wrapped in a heavy coat against the cold. Mrs. Hastings, Margaret said, come in. Eleanor entered, looked around the warm cabin, touched the walls, stood quiet for a moment. I need to tell you something, she said finally, something I should have told you months ago. Margaret waited. Eleanor took a breath. The words came out heavy like stones she'd been carrying too long. 20 years ago, I lived in Wisconsin, small settlement much like this one. There was a Norwegian family there. The father had come from Bergen. He built a cabin with 2 walls and an air gap between them. Just like this. She gestured around the room. It worked. Kept them warm through the worst winter Wisconsin had seen in decades. While everyone else froze and burned through cords of wood, they stayed comfortable, just like you are now. Margaret's eyes narrowed. What happened to them? The men in the settlement called it witchcraft, said it was dangerous, foreign, unnatural. They pressured the family to tear it down. And when the family refused, Eleanor's voice dropped. They burned it, at night, while the family was sleeping. They all got out alive, but they lost everything. And the settlement ran them out, told them to leave Wisconsin and never come back. The cabin fell silent. Even Joshua stopped playing. I was young then, Eleanor continued, just married. I saw it happen and said nothing, did nothing. I was afraid, and I've carried that shame for 20 years. She looked at Margaret directly. When you started building, I recognized the design. I knew it would work, but I tried to discourage you. Not to protect you from failure, to protect you from what I was afraid the men here might do. I thought if I could convince you to stop, you'd be safe. But I was wrong. My silence, my fear, it was the same cowardice I showed 20 years ago. Margaret absorbed this, then asked the question that mattered. Eleanor, why are you telling me this now? Because I won't be silent again. When the real test comes, when winter truly hits, I'll stand with you. I'll tell the council and everyone else that this design works and has worked before. And if any man tries to harm you or this cabin, he'll have to go through me first. The 2 women looked at each other, and something passed between them. Understanding. Alliance. The bond of women who'd survived in a world run by men who feared what they couldn't control. Thank you, Margaret said simply. Eleanor nodded, left, and Benjamin, who'd heard everything, felt something shift inside him. His mother wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, not everyone in the settlement was against them. But that same night at 2 in the morning, the world tried to break them. Benjamin woke to a sound like thunder. Close, dangerous, wood cracking. His mother was already moving, grabbing her coat. Stay with Sarah and Joshua, she said. But Benjamin didn't listen. He pulled on his boots and followed her outside into the bitter night. Wind, strong wind, 30 miles per hour, gusting to 40. And snow. Heavy snow that had fallen while they slept, piling on the second roof. And there on the north side of the cabin, 8 feet of the outer wall had partially collapsed. One saddle notch joint had failed under the snow load and wind pressure. The logs had shifted. The gap was exposed. Cold air rushed in like water through a cracked dam. Margaret stood in the snow, staring at the damage. And for the first time since William died, Benjamin saw his mother's strength waver. Saw her shoulders slump, saw her face crumble just slightly. The temperature inside the cabin was already dropping. 62 degrees, 58, 54, falling fast. Anders appeared, having heard the crack from his nearby cabin. He assessed the damage with a builder's eye. Can be fixed, he said, but it'll take 3 days, maybe 4, and we'll be working in freezing conditions. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. We don't have 3 days. Council inspects tomorrow. Benjamin watched his mother, watched her stand in the snow and wind, watched her look at the broken wall and the exposed gap and the failure of everything she'd worked for. And he made a decision, stepped forward, put his hand on her arm. Ma, he said, Pa failed once in Bergen, and he tried again. You taught me that. We don't quit because something breaks. We fix it and make it stronger. Margaret looked down at her 9-year-old son, and something came back into her eyes. That steel core that had carried her through 6 months of widowhood and 3 months of backbreaking work and endless mockery. You're right, she said. We fix it. They worked through the night. Margaret, Anders, and Benjamin. Sarah stayed inside with Joshua, keeping them warm as the temperature continued to drop. By dawn, they had the framework stabilized. By noon, they had replaced half the damaged section. And at 2 in the afternoon, Robert Brennan arrived with 2 other council members. He saw the broken wall, saw the exposed gap, saw Margaret and Benjamin working in the cold hands, bleeding faces, exhausted, and he smiled. Well, Mrs. Harper, looks like your experiment has failed, just done as I predicted. Margaret didn't stop working, didn't look at him, just positioned another log. It hasn't failed, Mr. Brennan. One joint gave way under unusual snow load. We're repairing it. The structure is unsafe. You should accept the council's offer, sell the property. Move to town where your children will be warm and safe. Anders stepped forward. Why do you want this land so badly, Brennan? Brennan's eyes narrowed. What? You've been pushing for Mrs. Harper to fail since the beginning. Why, what's your interest? For a moment, Brennan didn't answer. Then, perhaps thinking the battle was already won, he spoke the truth. The trading post is expanding. This location is perfect for a new warehouse. I have investors ready. Business is business, Johansson. Nothing personal. The words hung in the cold air, and suddenly everything made sense. The opposition, the mockery, the predictions of failure. Brennan didn't care about safety or proper building techniques. He wanted the land, and he'd been waiting for Margaret to give up so he could buy it cheap. Benjamin felt rage, pure hot rage. This man had made his life miserable, had called his father a failure, had wanted them to freeze. Not because he cared about right and wrong, because he wanted to make money. Margaret stopped working, turned to face Brennan. Her voice was ice. You wanted my children to be cold. You wanted us to fail so you could profit. That's what this has been about from the beginning. Brennan shrugged. Business is business. Then watch me rebuild, Mr. Brennan. And when this cabin stands strong through the worst winter Minnesota has seen, when my family stays warm while yours shivers, remember this moment. Remember that you chose profit over truth. Brennan opened his mouth to respond, but Eleanor Hastings appeared walking through the snow with 2 other women. We're here to help, Eleanor announced, not asking, stating. The women organized quickly, some watching children, some preparing materials, some holding ropes and fetching tools. By evening, the north wall was fully repaired, stronger than before. Every joint double-checked, extra moss and clay ceiling. By December 20th, the cabin was sealed again. Temperature inside rising steadily. 58 degrees, 61, 63, back to normal. The crisis had passed, but something had changed. The community had split, some still with Brennan believing the widow would eventually fail. But others, seeing the repair work, seeing the women helping, seeing the determination, began to wonder. And on December 21st, the sky changed color, turned steel gray, the smell in the air shifted, that metallic scent that comes before the worst storms. Anders checked his barometer, watched it fall, looked at Margaret with serious eyes. Big storm coming, maybe the biggest I've seen. By noon, the temperature was dropping fast. 15 degrees, 0, -10, wind picking up, 20 miles per hour, 30, 40. The trading post bell rang. Blizzard warning. Everyone prepare. Stock wood, board windows, stay inside. Across the settlement, families scrambled. Brennan stacked massive amounts of wood. Sullivan double-checked his fireplace. Eleanor gathered her household. Margaret checked her calculations one more time, looked at her modest woodpile, and trusted the math. That evening, she tucked the children in bed early. "Tomorrow will be very cold," she told them, "but we'll be safe here." Benjamin wrote the final entry in the temperature log before sleeping. December 21st, 1883, 11 at night, interior 64 degrees, exterior -28. Wood used today 1/4 cord. He set the pen down, heard wind beginning to howl outside. But inside the cabin, everything was quiet, warm, peaceful. At 2 in the morning, the blizzard hit. Johnny's eyes were wide. His grandfather had paused, letting the moment hang there. The blizzard coming, the cabin sealed. A 9-year-old boy trusting in mathematics and still air and his dead father's design. "What happened, Grandpa?" Johnny's voice was barely a whisper. Benjamin Harper looked out the window of his Minneapolis home. 1946 snow falling gentle and harmless. Nothing like the storm he was about to describe. He turned back to his grandson. "What happened," he said slowly, "was the coldest night in Minnesota history. And it taught me something I've carried for 63 years. The difference between surviving and thriving, between endurance and comfort, between accepting the world as it is and building something better." He settled deeper into his chair. "That blizzard didn't just test your grandmother's cabin, Johnny. It revealed who people really were. And some of those revelations came too late." 2 in the morning, December 22nd, 1883. Benjamin woke to a sound unlike anything he'd heard before. Not just wind, something more primal, like winter itself had become a living thing and was screaming. He got out of bed, looked toward the window. Couldn't see anything, just a white, pure absolute white. Wind at 40 miles per hour, gusting to 50, visibility 0. The thermometer mounted outside the window read -32 degrees Fahrenheit. Benjamin's first thought was fear. His second was curiosity. He walked to the cabin wall, put his palm against the inner surface. Warm. Walked to the inspection gap, reached through carefully, touched the outer wall surface, frozen solid, like touching ice. 18 inches between his two hands, one touching warmth, one touching death, and between them, nothing but air that didn't move. He heard his mother rise, saw her check on Sarah and Joshua, both sleeping peacefully under single quilts. No shivering, no cold making them restless, just normal sleep in a warm room, while outside the world was trying to kill everything it touched. Margaret lit a candle, checked the interior thermometer. 61 degrees. She added a moderate amount of wood to the stove. Not frantically, not desperately, just maintaining steady heat. She saw Benjamin watching. "Can't sleep," she asked quietly. "Too loud outside." "Come here." She led him to the center of the cabin, away from the walls. And in that center space with the double walls surrounding them and the gap holding the cold at bay, the sound was different, muted, like the storm was happening in another world. "Listen," she said, "hear how quiet it is here. The gap dampens the wind noise, holds back the cold, and keeps us safe." Benjamin understood then, really understood, not just with his mind, but with his whole body. The cabin worked. The gap worked. His father had been right. His mother had built it correctly. And they were going to survive. But 63 years later, sitting in his Minneapolis living room, old Benjamin knew something his 9-year-old self didn't know that night. While they slept warm and safe, other families were fighting for their lives. Robert Brennan's cabin, 3 children, a wife, a stove burning at maximum capacity, wood disappearing at an alarming rate, and the temperature inside holding stubbornly at 34 degrees. Brennan fed the fire constantly, added more wood, bigger pieces. The stove roared, heat poured out, and immediately escaped through the single log walls. Lost to the night. The cold was winning. His youngest daughter, Emma, 5 years old, started shivering, uncontrollable shaking. Brennan wrapped her in every blanket they owned, held her close to the fire, but her lips were turning blue. The early signs of hypothermia. His wife looked at him with terrified eyes. "Robert, she needs more warmth. She needs—" She didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what she was going to say. "She needs what the widow's cabin has." Brennan looked at his woodpile through the window. maybe 8 hours left at the current burn rate, looked at his 3 children, all suffering, cold, in danger, and he had to choose pride or survival, being right or saving his family. Across the settlement, John Sullivan fought the same battle. His stone fireplace, massive and well-built, roared with flame, beautiful to look at, impressive in its heat output. But his cabin's interior temperature wouldn't rise above 40 degrees. The heat went straight up and out. Lost. He burned furniture, started with an old chair, then a table, anything to maintain the fire. His children huddled together under every blanket wearing coats, and still they shivered. Eleanor Hastings' cabin held 6 people, 3 generations. They abandoned the other rooms, gathered in the smallest space, shared body heat, burned everything they could, and kept the temperature at a barely survivable 38 degrees. Her oldest daughter showed early frostbite on her fingers, the tips going white, losing feeling. Eleanor wrapped them carefully, knew it wasn't enough, prayed for dawn. And at the far edge of the settlement, in a small cabin that had always been borderline inadequate, Martin and Beth Harris faced something worse. Martin was 38, proud, independent. He'd come to Minnesota 3 years earlier with big dreams and limited resources. Built his cabin cheap, stocked less wood than he should have, and refused to ask for help because asking was admitting failure. That night, his cabin temperature dropped to 30 degrees, then 28, then 26. Beth begged him, "Martin, please take the boys to the Harpers or the Sullivans. Anyone, they're so cold." Their 2 sons, 6 and 8 years old, lay under every piece of fabric in the cabin. Coats, blankets, spare clothes. And still they shook. Martin looked at his nearly empty wood pile, looked at his family, and made the worst decision of his life. "We'll be fine. Morning will come. We just need to hold on." Pride, stubbornness, fear of admitting he'd failed to provide. Whatever the reason, Martin Harris chose wrong. But in the Harper cabin, dawn came gentle. Benjamin woke warm, heard his mother making breakfast, smelled food cooking. Sarah and Joshua already up playing quietly. The interior temperature was 60 degrees. The stove had burned through the night on minimal fuel. Outside, the storm still raged, minus 35 degrees. Wind at 45 miles per hour sustained. Snow piling in drifts 4 feet high. But inside, they were fine, comfortable, safe. Margaret made porridge. They ate breakfast like it was any normal morning. The surreal contrast between their reality and what Benjamin would learn was happening elsewhere made him feel strange, guilty almost, but also grateful. At 10 in the morning, Robert Brennan made his decision. His daughter Emma's condition had worsened. Her shivering had become violent. Her skin was cold to the touch despite being wrapped in blankets right next to the fire. His wood supply was critically low, and he knew with the certainty that comes from watching your child suffer that they might not survive another 12 hours. He strapped on his snowshoes, put on every layer he owned, wrapped his face in cloth. His wife grabbed his arm. "Robert, where are you going? You'll die out there." "To see if I was wrong," he said, "and if I was, maybe the widow will help us." The journey was half a mile, normally 5 minutes. That morning it took 20. Brennan told Benjamin years later what it was like. Every step a battle. Wind knocking him down twice. Snow so thick he navigated by memory and prayer. Temperature so cold that breathing hurt. Each inhale like knives in his lungs. His eyelashes froze together. He had to blink hard to break the ice. His fingers went numb inside thick gloves. His face, even wrapped, felt like it would burning and freezing at the same time. He thought he might die, genuinely thought the storm would take him. But the image of Emma's blue lips kept him moving. Finally, through the white chaos, he saw it. The strange double-walled cabin, looking solid, somehow defiant against the storm. He climbed the steps, raised a frozen fist, knocked on the outer door. Benjamin opened it, 9 years old, looking up at a man who'd made his life miserable for months. A man covered in ice, face hidden behind frozen cloth, eyes desperate, and immediately, even at 9, Benjamin felt it. Warm air drifting out from between the 2 doors. The airlock space. The gap. It was warm. 40 degrees at least. Warmer than Brennan's cabin with a fire roaring inside it. Brennan stood there, couldn't speak, just stared at the boy and felt his entire understanding of the world crack open. "Mr. Brennan," Benjamin said, "are you all right?" Margaret appeared behind Benjamin. Saw Brennan, saw his condition. Whatever anger she might have held disappeared in the face of a human being in distress. "Come inside," she said. Benjamin opened the inner door, and warmth rolled out. Real warmth, 63 degrees, like stepping into a different season, a different world. Brennan entered. His frozen clothes started to thaw. Water dripped from his coat. He unwrapped his face covering with numb fingers, and just stood there, looking around. Sarah and Joshua playing on the floor. No coats, light clothes, comfortable. The stove burning quietly in the corner. Not roaring, not consuming wood at a desperate rate, just steady, moderate. Benjamin watched Brennan's face, saw the exact moment belief changed, saw resistance crack, saw a man who'd been absolutely certain confronting absolute proof that he'd been wrong. Brennan walked to the stove, put his hand near it. Normal heat, not intense, just consistent. He walked to the wall, pressed his palm against the inner surface. Warm wood. Margaret showed him the inspection gap. Brennan reached through with a shaking hand, touched the outer wall surface. Frozen solid. He stood there with one hand touching warmth and the other touching ice, 18 inches apart, the gap between them holding back winter. "How?" he whispered. "How is this possible?" Margaret could have turned him away, could have reminded him of every cruel word, every prediction of failure, every attempt to take her land. But she didn't. She showed him the temperature log. 3 weeks of data, her cabin averaging 63 degrees with minimal fuel. His cabin she'd observed from a distance, struggling to maintain 45 while burning massive amounts of wood. She showed him William's drawings, explained the principle. Still air as insulation, heat unable to cross the gap easily. The same design Norwegian stabber buildings had used for centuries. The same principle that kept ship cargo holds moderate in Arctic crossings. Brennan studied the drawings with the focus of a man whose profession was being redefined in front of him. 17 cabins he'd built, all standing, all functional, but all inefficient, all wasting fuel, all keeping families barely warm enough to survive but never comfortable. He looked at Margaret, and words came that Benjamin never thought he'd hear. "I wanted your land," Brennan said, voice raw. "The trading post is expanding. This location would make me money. Good money. I convinced myself your design was dangerous. But the truth is, I wanted it to fail. I let greed blind me to something real, something important." He looked at Benjamin, the boy he'd mocked, whose father he'd insulted. "And your family nearly paid the price for my greed. I'm sorry, truly sorry." Margaret's voice was quiet. "Are your children safe, Mr. Brennan?" "No, Emma's showing hypothermia signs. Temperature in my cabin's at 32 degrees. We're in trouble." "Then go back. I'll show you a temporary fix. Hang blankets from your ceiling and walls. Create smaller air pockets. It's crude, but it might raise your temperature enough." "Why would you help me?" "Because keeping children warm matters more than being right." Brennan left, made the brutal journey back, implemented Margaret's suggestion, hung every blanket and sheet from ceiling and walls, created smaller spaces within the larger cabin. Dead air pockets, crude but effective. His cabin temperature rose to 38 degrees, not comfortable, but enough. Emma stabilized. His children survived, but not everyone did. December 23rd, 6 in the morning. The storm began to fade, wind dropping, snow stopping, sky clearing to that sharp, painful blue that follows the worst weather. John Sullivan, worried about neighbors, started checking on people. Made his way through waist-deep snow to the Harris cabin at the settlement's edge. Knocked on the door. No answer. Called out. Nothing. He forced the door open and found something that would haunt him the rest of his life. Martin Harris lay near the dead fire. Frozen. Gone. Beth barely alive. Severe frostbite on both hands. Unconscious. 2 boys, 6 and 8, also unconscious. Critical hypothermia, but alive. Barely. Sullivan ran for help. Gathered men. They carried Beth and the boys through the snow to the nearest warm place. The Harper cabin. Margaret and Eleanor worked to save them. Warm water, gradual rewarming, careful monitoring. The boys survived. Beth survived, but lost 4 fingers to frostbite. Martin Harris was buried 3 days later. The first death from the blizzard, and it was preventable. That afternoon, 7 men gathered at the trading post. Brennan, Sullivan, Judge Morrison, Anders, others. They sat in heavy silence. Finally, Brennan spoke. Martin could have brought his family to Mrs. Harper's cabin, or any of us could have offered shelter. If we'd believed her, if we'd supported her, instead of mocking her, he'd be alive. Sullivan nodded. She tried to tell us. The science was sound. We rejected it because of pride, because of fear of something new, because a woman built it. Anders added, William tried to teach people about this in Bergen. They rejected him too. Margaret proved what he couldn't, and we almost destroyed her for it. Judge Morrison looked around the table. Gentlemen, we have a moral obligation. We need to verify her design publicly, test it properly, and if it works as we now suspect, we help others build the same. They decided on systematic testing. 3 cabins monitored for 1 full week. Margaret's, Brennan's, Sullivan's. 4 measurements daily. Temperature data, fuel consumption, family comfort reports. All documented, all public. December 24th, 7 men arrived at the Harper cabin to conduct detailed inspection. Margaret was caring for Beth Harris and her boys. She granted the men full access to everything. Benjamin, at his mother's request, served as guide, showed them the temperature log, demonstrated the gap, explained the drainage system that prevented his father's Bergen failure, showed them how the double-door airlock worked. 9 years old and teaching grown men about engineering principles they should have understood months ago. The men measured everything. Interior temperature 64 degrees. Airlock temperature 42 degrees. They reached through the inspection gap and felt the outer wall. Frozen solid. Touched the inner wall. Warm. They reviewed the data. December 1st through 23rd. Margaret's cabin averaged 63 degrees. Wood consumption 3 cords total. Brennan's cabin 46-degree average, 15 cords burned. The difference was undeniable. John Sullivan spoke for the group. Mrs. Harper, we failed you. We failed your husband's memory. We failed Martin Harris. Will you teach us to build these cabins? Will you help us make this the standard instead of the exception? Margaret's answer was simple. Yes. Christmas Day, 1883. The Harper cabin filled with visitors, people from the settlement and from town, coming to see the miracle cabin, coming to verify with their own eyes. Beth Harris, lying in bed with bandaged hands, asked to speak with Margaret. Mrs. Harper, she said, voice weak but determined, will you teach me to build one? I can't use my hands well anymore, but I can direct others. For Martin's memory. For my boys. I want to build the cabin he should have built. Eleanor Hastings stood at the settlement, meeting January 1st, 1884. The week-long test complete, data documented, results public. She told the assembly about Wisconsin, about the Norwegian family 20 years earlier, about the cabin that worked and the men who burned it, about her silence and her shame. No more, she said. This design works. It's not witchcraft, it's engineering. We should all build it. Standing ovation, first for Eleanor's honesty, then for Margaret. Brennan stood next. The hardest thing he'd ever done. I let greed and pride blind me. Mrs. Harper, I was wrong, publicly completely wrong. Please forgive me. And please teach me to build these properly. 17 families committed to building double-wall cabins that spring. Margaret held classes, teaching not just men but women too. She'd proven a woman could understand engineering. Other women wanted to learn. Benjamin, 9 going on 10, helped teach, explain principles his mother had taught him. The boy who'd been mocked became the boy who instructed. Spring came. April, May, June. 17 families building simultaneously. Shared labor, shared knowledge, shared resources. Brennan, humbled and determined to make amends, worked hardest. Built for 3 families beyond his own. By September 12, cabins complete. By October 16. By November 1884, 19 double-wall cabins stood in the settlement. Margaret's original plus 18 new ones. When winter came again, not as severe as the previous year, But still brutal at minus 22 degrees, no one panicked. 19 families stayed warm easily. Zero deaths, zero serious frostbite. The community had learned. The settlement council voted to make double wall construction the recommended standard. Not mandatory, but strongly encouraged. Margaret was offered an official position, settlement building consultant. She accepted. Benjamin stopped talking. Let the silence hold. Johnny sat forward, processing everything. Grandpa, what happened after that? To grandmother, Benjamin smiled. Your grandmother lived to 91 years old, died in 1929. She became renowned across Minnesota, helped design over 200 double-wall cabins. Her principles were eventually adopted into early building codes. The Harper Gap method, they called it. Studied in engineering schools. And you, Bahram? I became a civil engineer. Everything I learned first from Ma. She taught me engineering before I knew what the word meant. I served in World War I as a military engineer, built bridges, fortifications, using efficiency principles Ma taught me. Retired in 1944. He stood, walked to the window, looked at the double pane glass. You know what this window is? Johnny? Still air between two panes of glass. Same principle as Ma's cabin gap. Miniaturized. 70 years later, still working. That's legacy. He turned to his grandson. The cabin's still standing. Want to go see it? Johnny nodded eagerly. Benjamin picked up the old photograph, looked at it one more time. The strange double-walled structure, the 18-inch gap, the design everyone had mocked. You know what I learned that winter, son? That the greatest barriers aren't always what you build. Sometimes the most powerful thing isn't what you add to the world. It's what you leave out. 18 inches of empty air, nothing at all, and that nothing saved 17 lives. He put the photograph in his pocket. Come on, let's go visit where it all began. Time you saw your heritage. They put on coats and stepped into the gentle 1946 snow. 2 generations walking toward the past, toward a cabin that had proven a simple truth. That innovation often comes from unexpected sources. That old wisdom can solve new problems. That the strongest walls are sometimes made of nothing at all. And that sometimes, just sometimes, being mocked by everyone means you're the only one who's right. The Harper cabin stood waiting, still teaching, still warm, still proving that a 43-year-old widow in 1883 understood something the world would take decades to fully appreciate. The power of the gap, the secret of still air, the 18-inch victory.